Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, from where you might be in the countryside. We're going to commence our meeting shortly, but prior to that, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to them and their cultures and to the elders past and present. Thank you for joining us today. We have around a 45-minute presentation today. Your microphone will be muted from our side until question time at the end. Please feel free to add any questions and or comments on the chat function, and we'll attempt to answer those as we proceed through the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the CASA briefing channel in the next few days. For those of you that have attended these presentations previously, you might be familiar with the AV Safety webinar digital badges, and we want to recognise your commitment to continuous learning with a digital badge for attending this webinar. You can add this to your email signatures, digital resume, and also your social media. And the eligibility, just stay for the duration of the webinar, as I mentioned, 45 minutes. You will receive an email from our digital badge partner, Credly, and just follow the prompts to claim your badge. So my name is Terry Horsam. I'm an Aviation Safety Advisor at CASA. And joining me today is Jaime Taylor, who's a Pilot and Safety Manager at Flinders Island Aviation. Jamie is also one of 3 recipients of the CASA Safety Manager Scholarship for 2024. So congratulations on that achievement, Jamie, and thank you for joining us for this very important webinar. The scope of today's webinar is a presentation from Jamie talking about his organisation, which is a small air transport day VFR, the winter operations and lessons that we can all learn from an operator such as Jamie's. We'll then just follow up with some winter operations, some hints and tips, some gotchas, and also some reminders. So I'm going to let Jamie take over at this point and proceed with his presentation. Please feel free to use that chat function as I mentioned. Thanks, Jamie.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Terry mentioned, I am a Tasmanian-based safety manager and currently head of flying operations based here in Bridport. Scope of work is throughout the Bass Strait, so things are fairly variable for us down here from time to time. Obviously, winter operations are a big part of life here in Tasmania, particularly from now right through until about September. I'm just going to run through just some things that I've learned along the way, having flown in the north and now the south. And I can hand on heart say the winter down here is probably the most difficult and challenging flying I've done. So I'm just going to run through a few things that I've learned along the way and a few gotchas, just like Terry said. The best way for me to sort of look at winter flying was more so from not a regulatory side, but from an operational side is the PAVE model. A lot of our governing bodies in aviation across the world use exactly this format, and PAVE is a perfect way to do it because it really does tick off a few things. So pilot, aircraft environment, and external pressures. First thing is to assess yourself. Winter flying can be very challenging, and if you are most companies have this on their board. I've got it on the board behind me. The I'm Safe checklist for any pilot, whether it be winter or summer, it should be used. And a lot of these things that are on this list, if you guys are out and about flying or you're a commercial or private operator and you've got any of these items on the I'm Safe checklist come up, it's probably not the time to go and test whether or not you can do it or not. So I really do encourage everyone at the beginning of each day, particularly in winter when it is cold, go through this I'm Safe checklist, because the last thing you want to be doing is heading out in the cold weather and one of these items come up, particularly with stress. I find myself, summer's usually, quite nice weather down here in Tasmania, but when the weather is variable here in Tasmania in the winter months, stress creeps into a lot of pilots, decision making and their flying. And it's certainly not something that you need when you are flying commercially or privately for that matter. Just a couple of things, you know, once you've evaluated just the I'm Safe checklist, particularly in the winter months, for myself, when I am doing line training, knowing a pilot's ability is really important. So one of the things that I do in a line process, or, you know, line training process is, you know, get the pilot to consider whether they are ready versus what, you know, do they think that they're ready? So they are two very different things. So you can see there on the slide, you know, pilots really need to consider, you know, their own experience, recency, currency, physical condition, emotional condition as well. And there's a few things that I put in place for our pilots, or to make some adjustments for charter operations, particularly with the passenger side, and really put some benchmarks in place before I set them out. This morning was a classic example here. You know, we are a day VFR business. We had freezing fog, which is something that a lot of people in this country probably don't see every day. Freezing fog is quite common, and it happens very quick, and it usually happens as the sun comes up. So I put some parameters in place for when our pilots are starting out, and particularly in our passenger operations. And you can see they're just simple things, like I add a 500-foot base into any forecasted cloud base that might be on a TAF or on a gaff. And the reason I do that is I don't necessarily want, you know, a young pilot fresh out of flight school to go and face a descending cloud base in the middle of winter. The cloud base can drop in a matter of moments here. Typical Bass Strait terminology, you wait 5 minutes and see what happens, and then 9 times out of 10 you can actually depart. So I add these, you know, these benchmarks onto to a new pilot, so they can build up their professionalism, build up their experience, and then when they do face the next winter, they're ready to go. And you can see there, roaring 40s in the Bass Strait are 100% real. We get them all the time, and obviously every aircraft has a crosswind limit. Again, one of the things that I do is I put a limit in place, because a lot of students don't face what the aircraft is capable of, and nor should they. However, if they are faced with it in operations, particularly in winter when we get the frontal weather come through, these parameters are in place. And you can do that privately as well. I would encourage private pilots to really consider these and put some their own parameters in place while they get used to it, because this stuff comes up very quickly in your flying. The next part of it is dressing for the occasion. Dressing for what you perceive to be cold weather might be different to what we think is cold down here. So down here this morning, just to give you an example, we had, you know, 3 below zero, between 3 and -5. It was very cold. And in the back of the Ursa, it actually runs through some basic survival techniques. Not that you necessarily need the survival that we shouldn't need, survival techniques day in, day out, but it really does give you a bit of an idea of what you should be wearing in a cold environment. Again, when you're cold, it can affect a lot of different things. You know, your stress goes up, your decision making can go downhill. So, you know, here at Flinders Island Aviation, we really do put some thought into what our pilots are wearing out there, because they are outside. So again, as per the ATPL and CPL syllabus, a lot of light layers is better than one big jacket that you put on. One big jacket is also very hard to get off when you're in the cockpit. Now we're onto the aircraft component of PAVE, and this is probably the most serious one of the lot, what I would consider the most serious, and particularly going into winter. You've flown all summer, beautiful weather, and then all of a sudden you go and turn your heaters on. Obviously, that for a lot of piston engine aircraft, a lot of the air or heating systems is from, you know, a heat exchanger that comes in off the exhaust, and that is where we get our heating from. If it hasn't been used for a long time, as with a lot of things, there can be, you know, damage, cracks. I mean, it's unlikely, but it is more, if you have a look at the statistics, coming into winter, or the first time you use it, is probably going to be the time that you encounter carbon monoxide poisoning. And there's been a push of late for the use of detectors, both passive and active. And, you know, the active component or the active version of them is far better than the passive. However, another redundancy that I personally do in my flying, particularly in winter, is I actually every year I buy a redundancy CO detector, and it's clipped to my headset bag. And the reason for that is things fail, they are perishable, and heaven forbid that one did fail in the cockpit. Obviously, in your maintenance program, they are changed. But I've got a redundancy one. So if one's going off and the other one isn't, it's probably a good indication that one, you've got an issue, or two, there might be a faulty one. However, if one goes off, you need to get yourself onto the ground, get the aircraft ventilating. But winter, that is a very serious problem, particularly here in Tasmania and Victoria. So here I've just listed again, most people in their PPL, CPL, and now ATPL subjects will encounter these symptoms. It's actually quite handy to know what they are. We've got a little placard on our wall here for our pilots, just to remind them of what they're looking for. Again, heaven forbid it does happen and one goes off, the pilots know what to look for and how to remedy it. So the next thing is, there's two things here that are very important, and it's to do with carburetor machines. And the next slide that I'll show you is to do with your battery. As we all know, in the colder weather, our carburetor machines do not like to start. And it's, I've seen it a couple of times now. One actually was in Queensland, where, you know, people think they haven't put enough fuel in, and then they introduce one big spark and all of a sudden you have an engine fire. The biggest thing with engine fires in that situation on a cold morning is knowing how to remedy it, or apply a remedy to get away with it. So, I mean, your starter is one thing, but your engine is another. So if you do encounter, or, you know, once the fuel's dripping into the cowl and onto the ground, you probably, well, the only thing you really can do is continue to crank the machine. You're better off harming your starter motor than you are, you know, a whole engine. So for those that are going to, you know, eventually fly in Victoria or in Tasmania, it's probably a timely reminder to look at your POH and revisit some of the starting procedures. Like Homing do very well in issuing supplementary guides on how to start in cold weather. A lot of them are directed for the US, you know, pilots in the US, where it is, you know, well below zero. However, failed starts are extremely common, and knowing when to stop and restart is something that you really need to be savvy with. Engine fires are very real. They happen all the time in the cold temperatures. And another contributor to that is battery performance. So battery performance, as you can see here or on the slide, your battery works a lot harder to start in the colder weather, particularly in something like a turbine. One of the last things you check before you engage the starter, we operate a caravan here, is to make sure that you have the correct volts. If you're below volts, there is a raft of issues you can have on that start. So again, if you're a private pilot in a 182 carburetor machine, the classic 182 scenario with engine fires, it's very, very common. Check your voltage, make sure everything's good before you do attempt to start, because if you do end up with an engine fire and the battery is already struggling, it's not going to end up in a good situation. The next portion of the PAVE is environment. So environment here in Tassie is massive. All of our weather, or 90% of our weather, is particularly in the winter months, is frontal weather. We have fronts that roar through, last 30 minutes, and we have some that, you know, come through and they last a day. You know, the slower and more intense the front generally brings more rainfall. It's how Tassie gets its rainfall. So knowing that how those weather patterns work only plays in your advantage. So a really classic one here in Tasmania and Victoria is a lot of the fronts come from the west and move through to the east. And obviously the gaff you can see the timelines in a gaff. However, if you look at the TAFs as well, you will actually see the front moving from each port that it goes through. So in Tassie here, it generally hits King Island first, then you look at Burnie, Devonport, and then Launceston, St Helens. You can actually physically paint a mental picture in your head as to where the front is. And again, just having that picture in your head, the morning might be really great and the afternoon might be really bad, and that's due to the front moving through. And generally behind the front is picture perfect weather, but it's generally very windy. So again, very simple things that we all know as part of our CPL and PPL training. You know, cross-check the weather, you know, multiple times before you jump in. the weather can change at the drop of a hat. You know, in the colder states, particularly with cloud or precipitation. So a classic example this morning, I flew to Flinders this morning, beautiful weather, but there was two little cells just sitting there, nothing forecasted, nothing on the gaff, but visibility was absolutely superb this morning. But just reviewing the gaff and your TAF, and then making you know, in-flight decisions as to how you proceed in the winter months, particularly Tassie, Victoria, and South Australia, is very important. And just knowing, you know, where you stand, you know, the freezing level can drop, you know, quite quickly here. And you can see, you know, in the CASRs, Part 91, you know, if you don't have correct equipment, you shouldn't be going into known icing conditions, nor a classic example, again, this morning, we had ice on our windscreen and ice on the leading edge of the wing. We had to clear that before we even started the engine. There's no use taxiing out if you can't see out the windscreen. So here you can just, I put this in the PowerPoint just to show everyone how dynamic the weather can be here in Tassie. As you can see there, I've shown strawn there. The wind down in Tassie does get, you know, ridiculously strong. 50 knots is quite common. And if in those winter months, it's just knowing your capabilities, knowing the aircraft's capabilities before you even consider getting off the ground. The next part of the environment thing is a lot of the strips in Tasmania and Victoria. There's a lot of country strips. Some of them get quite short, and the aircraft you'll notice all up and down the east coast, the machines that people are flying are usually reflective of you know, where they're landing. We operate a fleet of air vans and 1208 for freight, and we land on a lot of ALAs that are extremely short. And we have a survey, a 6-month survey on all of our runways. Things change. Classic example on one of the islands we land at, there's a penguin colony, and every now and again the penguins decide to move closer and closer to the runway. And without doing those 6-monthly surveys of our runways, you would never sort of pick that up. So every time our crew go in there, we actually do a survey. And where I'm going with this with our winter flying is on those shorter strips, there's a need to factor in a number of different elements to be able to make it what I would deem to be commercially safe, or if you're taking a bunch of friends out to an island or a remote location, whether it is a short runway, you probably need to start considering things like frost, particularly in winter. So we all know the factors that we need to consider, but the frost or a frozen runway actually adds another 25% potentially onto your takeoff roll, or you need to factor, 25% in. It's really important. Again, Victoria and Tassie is well known for its peat. Peat is a soil mass, if you will. And that freezes. And for those that have seen that freeze, it is extremely slippery. And on a frosty morning, when it's frozen, you need to be factoring that into your takeoff and landing calculations. Again, that's exactly what I've just spoken. That cap 9102, very important for those that are dealing with, outside the ordinary. It just allows you to sort of pick it apart. And lastly, the external pressures. So after factoring in the weather, because typical in your commercial flying, and in some private cases, you want to get home, you want to get your mates to where they need to be, or you need to impress your boss or your head of flying. You need to think of the external factors that might be, weighing you down or stressing you. So get home-itis is typical, and it creeps into every pilot. No one's immune to it. And again, let's use a front as an example. A front's moving through middle of winter, freezing levels low cloud. You've got a pilot that wants to get home, passenger in the waiting on the ground. He's got an event to go to. End of daylight's approaching, which I'll talk about in a moment. And those external pressures are building on, and you give it a go. There's no need, and this is coming from, we've had a number of pilots cancel flights, and that's what we want to see here in the office is pilots making an informed decision. There's no use letting the external pressures build up on you And that's when your decision making starts to break down. You know, I'll give it a go for my boss and get there, or I'll get my friends to where they need to go and land on that short runway that's frosted over, just to make sure we get the weekend underway. These things need to be considered and need to be reviewed before you get in the plane. And probably one of the last things you really do need to consider is the last light. That is what I would consider to be an external pressure. You've always got, particularly in the charter world, you've got people that want to, you know, go somewhere for the day, have meetings, and then fly home as late as humanly possible. However, as a day VFR pilot in winter, that daylight savings gone, that approach is very quick. So what we do here in my planning, our pilots will not depart, or we plan to arrive back at our home base around 60 minutes before that end of daylight. 10 minutes is very tight. And by the time we're reaching that 10 minutes here in Tasmania, we've got a lot of mountains, the sun's dipped behind those, and it's quite dark. So in your planning, one of the redundancies that we put in here is 60 minutes. We don't need pilots out there stressing when, you know, if there's weather, particularly if there is weather. So just factor that into your planning. That's it, Terry.
Thanks, Jamie. Do we have any questions for Jamie at this moment? And we'll do a bit of a review shortly. Okay, we will get to your question, Richard, shortly regarding Jamie's roles as Head of Operations and also Safety Manager. But in the meantime, we'll continue on with our presentation. One of the things that stood out for me with Jamie's presentation was essentially the fact that you have provided quite a number of buffers on what the minimum requirements are. And I think this is really important for all pilots that are listening, not only in winter, but I guess more so in the winter months that these buffers do apply. So some of the things that we sort of thought we'd sort of review is just maintaining recency and competence in the winter months. And this can be a bit of a challenge, particularly as we've discussed with weather. And we know that in Australia, it's a big country, and there are some of the winter days can be actually better than other days in the year. However, if you know you're suffering from some of those frontal issues that Jamie mentioned, the opportunity to go flying might be quite limited. So just an idea of maintaining recency and also competence, which comes back to the 61.385 general competency rule, where pilots are required to actually maintain their own competence, and it can be quite difficult. And if you're not sort of doing any thinking about your flying in the downtime, suddenly you've got a nice day, you might sort of forget about some of the basics. So always remember you can fly the chair when you're not actually flying the aircraft. Jamie mentioned the possibility of flying with issues, and flying with a head cold, for instance, probably more likely during the winter months. And this probably means that you're self-medicating. And if you are, just remember that most of these over-the-counter drugs that we use carry a warning about operating machinery. So be aware of the possibility that your flying will be affected by the usage of these over-the-counter drugs. Fatigue's another one. We know that the days are shorter, so that means you've got less daylight to get things done. So monitor fatigue, because it's as we know, it's one of these things that can creep up on you. And we know also that we're not great at monitoring our own fatigue, or even understanding that we are fatigued, until we start making fatigue-related errors. And finally, with a review of your own personal performance, just your personal agendas. You know, we're all affected by daily life stresses outside of flying, which might bias our decisions. And this is true not only during winter, but obviously a combination of the above could be more likely during the colder seasons. Jamie mentioned a number of times the issues around operating an aircraft in winter. So this is just a quick reminder of some of the traps that the cold weather might deliver. Number one is flight in known icing conditions, and a couple of times now we've referred to the aircraft flight manual or the pilot operating handbook. You might not find yourself in the environment that the manufacturer manufactured this aircraft, in the sense that you know, we don't get extreme weathers as they do in Europe and United States. However, the recommendations that the manufacturer puts in place may apply to us, particularly when we do get the colder conditions. So, number one, ensure that you know that your aircraft is certified for flight in known icing conditions. Next thing, of course, is low utilisation. The picture we've got there, if you saw the aircraft looking like that, you'd probably realise that it hadn't flown for a while. This could result in battery issues, and when we go out to an aircraft, it might be haven't been used over a few weeks or months over winter. The battery might be a bit low, so we might be tempted to give it a hand start. And we've had a couple of accidents over the years where people have gone to hand start an aircraft and they've slipped because of the surface. You know, it's again, might be ice covered, or it could be just wet from the rain. Oil and lubrication are a standard one again, ensuring that you know, oil and lubrication is always checked. The ice and or anti-ice equipment check if you've got those on your aircraft. Fuel drains, we can expect tank condensation, and if you've got a leaking fuel cap, for instance, and there's been considerable amount of rain, we know that there'll be quite a bit of water possibly pooling in the tanks. So again, not necessarily a winter thing, but certainly possibly more likely during low utilisation. Pitot heat, is it working? How do you check? And is it required? We'll talk about the use of the heater and the carbon monoxide considerations as Jamie has. And again, noting that Jamie has put in place in his operation the carriage of the detectors. And finally, use of the demister on the aircraft. It's quite tempting sometimes to just wipe a little bit of a hole in the windscreen if you've got a fogged up windscreen, and then taxi to a fuel bowser. And we've seen a number of accidents and incidents over the years where people have been tempted to do that, and of course run into obstacles on the ground because they just haven't been able to see them. Continue on with the aircraft flight manual, the pilot operating handbook. You know, there are cold weather operations and precautions from most of the manufacturers. They'll also tell you about engine handling, things like use of the carburetor heat. And the paradox there, of course, is that carburetor heating can occur up to 30 degrees or beyond, depending on the humidity. The use of alternate air, and making a note there that it's not the alternate static air, but for an aircraft that is fuel injected, this is something that people don't necessarily always understand the use of. So particularly important because the manufacturer has given you an alternate source of air for those aircraft, and the use of it comes under the general competency rule again, 61.385. And the note about the passive chemical spot detectors for the carbon monoxide, and also the active digital CO detector. The ATSB has recommended that the active digital CO detector is obviously the more accurate, but as a bare minimum, they recommend that people do carry the passive detectors as well. Now, planning in the winter months, when we come to the environment, is about expecting the unexpected. And one of the things that you possibly don't expect is when the weather does get good, people are all out there, we're all trying to fly at the same time. So traffic can be something that that gets people, that we don't expect that increase in traffic. We can also get a bit complacent, and as I mentioned, knowing what to do in the event of an emergency is really important. And sometimes you know, the opportunity comes up that we can go flying tomorrow, but we haven't really thought about our flying for quite a while. So make sure that you are up to date with your emergency procedures. Jamie mentioned that they do operate in and out of a lot of ALAs, and I think that's probably true of most people in Australia. But ALAs in particular may not be maintained on a regular basis, and you can get grass growing and certain areas can become waterlogged. We've got to be aware of where we can taxi, also about the aerodrome markings, they may be overgrown, etc. So that's something that we've just got to consider. Long wet grass, Jamie made a comment there that they make an allowance over and above what they get out of their manuals for regarding the takeoffs, etc. So that's something that we've got to consider also. Something else that can occur in the environment is that you might get an increase in if the ALA hasn't been used for a while, you might find yourself with some extra wildlife in the area. Or you might even get some migratory birds, and a common one is to see Cape Barren geese in certain areas gathering on airfields. So they may be things that you don't see necessarily during some of the summer months. Fog's also more likely in the winter months. That seems like an obvious statement, but it may not be forecast and may or may not actually eventuate. It's just one of those things. The Bureau will tell you that it's not an easy thing to predict on occasion. So plan for extra time, and certainly when you are taking passengers anywhere, just manage their expectations. Let them know that the aircraft that you are operating may or may not be able to take off in low visibility. So let them know before they even get to the airport that you'll possibly not be flying at exactly the time that they want. Also knowing the characteristics of fog. When it comes to fog, it's pretty obvious when you're sitting on the ground and you can't see the windsock on the airfield because of the fog. But one of the characteristics that some of you would have no doubt experienced is that when you're flying overhead the airfield, looking down through the fog, you can actually see, you and your passengers could see the airfield quite clearly. And it's only when you get that slant, when you start to make your approach, that the fog completely blocks out the view, and you won't be able to see the runway from that perspective. And of course, fog can persist all day at some locations. So, they may give you a clearing time. They might say it's going to be clear by this time. However, the fog, being the characteristics that it has, could just stay there all day depending on the wind direction and the wind strength. Other environmental considerations, as we said, winter's a great time to fly with clear, cool conditions. However, some of the basics are that the sun is lower in the sky. Jamie mentioned the last light considerations and the fact that his company applies a considerable buffer onto last light. Really does take the pressure off the pilots in respect to the decision making and the prospect of running out of daylight. And it's really important that we continue to emphasise this to our passengers and again manage their expectations, particularly when you are limited to day VFR flights. Also terrain effect. Jamie did mention the high ground to the west, and you combine that with the lower sun in the sky, and it could be that you are going to arrive somewhere. If you're sitting up nice and high, you get down quite low to commence your landing, and you find that area is actually quite dark now. So again, those considerations. You might go out to your aircraft, as Jamie did this morning, and found that there was a considerable amount of frost on the aircraft due to the overnight conditions. So how do you detect, or how do you clear the ice on the critical surfaces? And I think particularly about those of you with aircraft with a T-tail, how do you get up to that area there and ensure that those critical surfaces are in fact clear? And remember, a bucket of warm water might not actually work on your wing. Putting water on it might disperse some of the ice, but if it refreezes at the critical point on the wing, you could actually make things a lot worse for yourself. Moving along. And the rules, basically, we've covered off on these, but flight in icing conditions and the adherence of frost, ice or snow is part 91.705. Before you begin a flight, there must be no frost, ice or snow adhering to the aircraft's wings, flaps, control surfaces, rotors, propellers, and horizontal or vertical stabilizers. Seems like an obvious rule. However, there can be times when you're tempted to go flying with that, or you just don't detect the fact that there is ice or frost on the wing. And again, flight in icing conditions. Requirements for flight. You must not commence a flight in known or suspected icing conditions unless your aircraft is certified as complying with the airworthiness standards to fly in those icing conditions. So they're fairly standard requirements, and again, something that we probably wouldn't see in the middle of summer here in Australia. So that kind of brings us to the end of our discussion. We've been going for a little under 40 minutes this afternoon, and we'd just like to get any questions and comments, and certainly are there any experiences that you've had flying in winter in Australia that you'd like to sort of make comment on, and maybe a couple of cautionary tales perhaps. So I'm going to put it out to everybody in the audience at the moment, and certainly if there's any questions specifically of Jaime, please let's ask for those now. Okay. Jaime, if I can bring you back into it just for a couple of questions. We did have one that's it's a little bit more on your role within Flinders Island Aviation, and it's not specifically to do with winter, but certainly how do you differentiate your roles as a head of operations and safety manager? Just a brief summary of that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. It is something, obviously, with the new regulations, and as we go down the regulation pathway, that is changing. I mean, it's actually quite interesting to work on both sides of the fence, and it's actually consolidated a lot of how I plan our flights, how I delegate certain things in day-to-day operations. Again, I haven't really answered how I differentiate it, but they are two very distinct roles, and I do have to have both caps on, and that is changing with the regulations, of course. But again, it's only helped me and developed me in my the more managerial roles in the flying, and it's actually been a bit of an eye-opener, because the safety management systems highlight a lot of areas that you don't necessarily think of all the time, and I've been able to implement that back into manuals. Our operations manual is an example, so it's actually been quite beneficial, but we're almost at a point now where we can separate it as we go down the regulation pathway.
Okay, that's great, and yeah, nice to know. And I think just by listening to your presentation there, the buffers that you put in place, the understanding of the human factors regarding your pilots is something that we can all sort of learn from, and putting those buffers in place to take the pressure off pilots is really important. We've got to do that for ourselves when we're privately flying. We've got to manage our own limitations, I guess. So we do have a couple of questions. Does CASA have a view about the use of active CO detectors that are integrated into a headset? Do you have anything on that one? Like it's a CASA question, but use of active CO detectors integrated into a headset, I would imagine, is quite handy.
I think I've had a CO2 detector go off before, and I think for myself personally, having information right in front of me is probably the way I'd prefer to have it. I just feel that visual cues are probably far more beneficial, particularly again when there is weather and things are not necessarily going your way. It happens all the time. Visual representation is a far safer option. That's my opinion. It's there in front of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think just from personal experience, anything that would highlight to you the fact that you are experiencing a problem, an oral warning does give you that extra level, I guess. But it's a lot of that could be personal opinion as well. There's another question here. There's a lot of options for CO detectors. Can CASA Flight Safety undertake testing and report on recommended reviewed active detectors that provide required sensitivity and response time suitable for aviation, or better yet, put out for tender for Australian electrical design and manufacturing a CO detector with specifications that meet aviation requirements? Good point. It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but certainly it's something that the airworthiness people can take on board. Is there any particular method or product that is used for anti-fog on windscreens, both internal and external? Jamie, do you use anything in particular to prevent the formation of fog, etc.?
There is a few products. Again, you do have to be a little bit careful. The Caravan is a classic one. They actually do make recommendations for certain chemicals that you can and can't put on windscreens. A lot of pilots will see Worth products floating around if they've got a maintenance facility. They make a really good anti-ice product that I would only use in very small amounts. Unfortunately, the best remedy for it is either you wait for the sun. Water is the worst thing you can put on your windscreen because it will refreeze. Again, most of your aircraft should have defrost systems in them. So I wouldn't go personally and put chemicals on the windscreen because you don't know how they're going to react to the sun. If you're flying late in the afternoon, you don't know what smudging they're going to put on the windscreen. So there's none that I can definitively say go for gold.
Yep. And again, at CASA, we don't necessarily recommend any products, etc. We do leave people to make their own experimentation as to what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Obviously, it would be great to be able to hanger every single aircraft that we've got, but it doesn't always pan out that way. So we did get an answer for Evan regards to the sensitivity, response times, etc. for the CO detectors. So if you have a look on the chat, one of our helpers here has put up the guidance material regarding preventing carbon monoxide poisoning in piston engine aircraft. Okay, if we've got any extra points, we've got another couple of minutes just to run before we do finish up. If not, what we'd like to do here at CASA is thank everybody for attending today. It's been a fairly broad discussion, and we sort of tried not to concentrate particularly on the stuff that we already know, the weather. We spend a lot of time here at CASA and at the ATSB, of course, discussing inadvertent flight into IMC, etc., and the prevention of such. But what we've tried to do here is to just provide an overview of some of the things that could go wrong, and I'd like to really thank Jamie for his insight as a day VFR operator in Bass Strait in Tasmania. It's probably about as relevant to winter flying as we can possibly get in this country. Okay, and just a final one from Cameron before we do finish. Regarding flight in icing, what general guidance is there for VFR flight around lifting fog? I would always get you to have a look at the Bureau of Meteorology Knowledge Centre and just have a look at basically the requirements that they have for forecasting fog, and also some of the characteristics of fog, because that's something that that's their realm. And as I mentioned, it's not the easiest thing to forecast, and sometimes that fog can hang around for days and days. So rather than give you some recommendations straight here, I definitely recommend that you look at the Bureau of Meteorology, their Knowledge Centre, and it's full of really good information. So as we finish up today, thank you so much to everybody. I trust everybody found it a good session in reminding us about the good, the bad, and the ugly side of flying in winter. In closing, please do avail yourselves of the resources available on the CASA website, including a link to this webinar. We'll wrap it up there, and the recording will be available in the next few days on the CASA briefing channel. Keep an eye out for the next season of webinars, and I hope you can all join us again for those. Thank you, and goodbye.